Shalom, good evening. Welcome to the practical Parsha for Parshat Shemini. In our book, it's on page 275, and that is in the book of Vayikra, the third book of the Torah, Leviticus, chapter 9. This Parsha, up to the sixth Aliyah, speaks about the inaugural day of the tabernacle, when they began the actual service in the Holy Temple. And for the first time, as God's presence dwelled in a physical abode, literally, and they can actually see and feel God's presence. And all that went with it. Okay? Now, that happened on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, on the first day of the month of Nisan, which happens to be coming up pretty soon. Okay, as we speak today, we're towards the end of the month of Adar. Wow. The month of Adar, and we will very soon be celebrating Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the first day of Nisan, which commemorates this day. Now, it speaks about God bringing His presence into a physical abode. It follows that God's presence is there in another very special, I want to call it housing. I want to call it a miniature Bet HaMikdash, a miniature holy temple. And that is the body of each and every Jew. Thus, at the end of the Parsha, beginning with the sixth Aliyah, which is chapter 11, in our book it's on page 280, God speaks to Moshe and Aaron, and He asks them to say to the Jewish people, He says, "Speak to the Bnei Israel, saying, these are the living things that you may eat from among all the animals that are on the earth." And it goes on prescribing and describing the signs of the kosher animals. Okay? Certainly, the signs of the kosher animals are well known, but it's worth going over again. It's animals which are, as you can see, as you can tell, any animal possessing these two, not one of these two, but both together. These two signs are typically domesticated animals. You'll see why that's important in a moment. So he says, verse 3, all that have a cloven hoof, and they, the hoofs, are completely split, and that also choose its cut amongst the animals you may eat. It doesn't say you have to eat, it says you may eat. Okay? You don't have to eat meat all the time, but this is the meat that Hashem allows us to consume when we consume meat. Now, later on, further on, it goes through all the non-kosher birds, the non-kosher fowl, describing them by name. And that's very interesting. Usually, when making a list, typically, the rule of thumb would be is you make a short list. So if God describes to us the non-kosher animals, the non-kosher birds, that gives us an idea that the non-kosher birds are less than the kosher birds. That means there's less of the non-kosher birds, and there's more of the kosher birds. Thus, Hashem names all the non-kosher birds, which is a shorter list, and leaves us with all the rest is kosher. I'll get to it in a moment, however, what, practically speaking, today's day and age, what we do not eat in terms of birds. Okay, we'll get to it soon. Then, it finishes off with the kosher fish and the non-kosher fish. And it tells us that the kosher fish are the ones that have scales, they have fins and scales. Okay? Those are the ones that are kosher. Those are the ones that we're allowed to eat. Okay? Any other ones are not permitted. Okay? Actually, that was mentioned before. I beg your pardon. That was mentioned before the birds. I got confused a little bit. Okay? So we have the animals, the birds, and then, the fish, and then the birds. Okay? Now, Before we talk about details of kashrut, it's important to bear this in mind. Ultimately, the reason for the kashrut laws are very simple. Because God said so. God said so. And when I say that, and I emphasize that, we know that there are three types of mitzvot. There are those mitzvot, and we've spoken about in the past. There are those mitzvot that are called mishpatim, which have a very judicial, logical, rational understanding, to the extent that most of them are such that one, as a human, as a decent human being, would have approached and reached that conclusion on their own, perhaps. Then there are the edut. Edut are those mitzvot which are testimonials, meaning Shabbat, or better yet, the festivals, things that testify, things that celebrate, things that commemorate an occurrence, an event, a miracle, and so on and so forth. Then there are the chukim. Chukim are statutes. Statutes mean those things that, to quote the Chazal, to quote the sages, quote unquote, it's a decree of the king. This is my decree, this is the way I want it. We have a choice to do it or not. But in terms of understanding them, perhaps we can understand some aspects of it, but ultimately, this is in the realm that's beyond our reach and our...
Beyond our paycheck.
Right, it's above our pay scale of understanding. Now, kashrut, the laws of kashrut, fit exactly into that category. So ultimately, why this particular animal is good for consumption and therefore good for my body and soul and my connection to my body and soul as a Jew, ultimately, is because Hashem said so. There is no real human rationale that can help us understand it and that can make sense of it. And I must say, there are those that try to make the argument, well, in those days, they lacked refrigeration, they lacked the sanitary conditions that we have available to us right now, and therefore it made sense, and therefore, for example, swine, the pig was off limits. They were told not to eat it because they were an enlightened people and they were aware of the bacteria issues and so on and so forth. God forbid. God forbid. First of all, what that's saying, what that's suggesting, is that the Torah is not divine. The Torah was given by man and was a result of the conditions of the time. If that's, God forbid, true, then you could throw the whole Torah out. It's not any holier than, forgive me, than Shakespeare. You understand? You understand? It was written by man, if that's the case, and it was inspired by the conditions of the time. That's, God forbid, the furthest from the truth. It's an absolute lie. Furthermore, what it does for people who, for whatever reason, choose not to keep kosher, it legitimizes for them in their mind, and it takes all the Jewish guilt away from not having to keep kosher. Because you're saying the reason that applied then no longer applies. But that's not true. The reason that applied then applies now, and will apply to the end of time. Because
Indeed.
Hashem gave it to us. Hashem told us this is what we could and this is what we cannot consume. Having said that, and having made the statement that the laws of kashrut are not due to any rationale, are not really explainable by any human logic, human understanding. Having said that, I must say that there are certainly many aspects of it that are explained to us by the Kabbalists, by the great Jewish thinkers. For example, the Ramban, Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, in his commentary on the Torah, does give certain suggestions that perhaps give us some insight into what God wanted for us here. And that is that the animals that are kosher, that fit the criteria, that have both signs, are typically animals that are domesticated. They're not animals that hurt other animals. They're not animals
They're not
that by
predators.
nature prey on other animals. They feed off the grass. They're just most of them are so they're
very docile.
pasture, they're just young. You know what I mean? And therefore, since this is what he says, since what we eat, what goes into us, becomes part of us, becomes our flesh and blood, and that certainly influences us. Just to add that today, with what the world of medicine has discovered, and the great heights that we've reached, we know that it actually becomes part of you, at least for sure physically, and it influences you not just now while you're eating and the energy you're getting and the pleasure you're getting from the taste, but for many, many years to come, whether it's in the positive or the negative. In this case, he says, spiritually, psychologically, from the soul aspect, it's influencing the person. And perhaps that's one of the, so to speak, benefits that Hashem wanted us to get, to derive. As we're eating and as we're sustaining ourselves, Hashem is giving us that direction of how to also keep our character traits, the influencers of our spiritual being, our psychological and emotional beings in check, in a proper harmonious way. You see that also with the example I said, the birds. Remember I mentioned that the birds, the Torah enumerates all the birds that are not kosher. And remember I said that's a short list. You usually will list a shorter one. Well, if that's the case, there should be thousands of various species of birds out there that are kosher. How come the absolute extent of kosher birds, of kosher fowl, will be perhaps chickens, which is chickens, turkeys, geese, ducks, doves. That's about it. I never really heard it. Maybe another one or two birds.
Pheasant.
But it's so limited, right? It's so limited that we hardly have any birds in the Jewish cuisine. Why is that? Furthermore, I'll give you another question. You know that if you follow these two signs of the kosher animals, giraffe should be kosher.
Yeah.
A giraffe has split hooves, and a giraffe has
chews their cud.
So if that's the case, how come we don't have giraffe in our child or on a Shabbos table? Many people would suggest, well, we don't know what to slaughter because it has a long neck. And I say no, I beg to differ. That's not true. Because anybody who has studied the laws of shechita, which I'll get to in a moment, the laws of how to properly, ritually slaughter an animal and bring it to a point that it can now be consumed by a Jew, meaning that it's kosher, knows that if you know the rules, you know exactly where you can or cannot slaughter the animal. In other words, it's the same rules apply, and it's proportionate to the size of the neck of the animal. So that cannot be the reason. So what then is the reason? Well, that's not the exclusive reason. What then is the reason? And what's the reason with the birds? And the answer is, especially nowadays, after everything the Jewish people have been through, after all of the trials and tribulations, and are being dispersed all over the world, there is one thing that keeps us tethered to that anchor, to that pole, and that is Kabbalah. And when I say Kabbalah, I don't mean the mysticism. I mean literally what Judaism is. Kabbalah means to receive. In English, the tradition. So the foods that we eat, the meat that we consume, is very heavily governed by the Kabbalah, the reception, what we saw our ancestors eating, consuming, and therefore what their ancestors consumed, and obviously what their ancestors going back. So for whatever reason they didn't consume, or they stopped consuming, let's say, giraffe meat, we no longer eat it. So today, to go against that would be going against the grain. If somebody came and tried to invent and go, look, why can't we eat giraffe? I don't know what the reason is. And since I don't know, especially when it comes to matters of observance, matters of kashrut, you don't say, well, there's no reason not to. No, there has to be every reason to do it in order to take that risk, in order to take that step forward and do it. So that's one example. The same example is with the birds. Since we don't know, since we haven't seen our ancestors eating them, going back, and certainly, there's nobody that has the authority and can in full confidence say, I know exactly what these biblical Hebrew names, what birds these are, and that this bird certainly is not in this species, therefore you cannot take any chances. So all you could do is you say, well, if the rabbis and the Rebbitzins, if the grandfathers and the grandmothers of the last 2 generations ate it, they saw their grandparents eating it, and they saw their grandparents eating it, and this goes all the way back to Moses in an unbroken chain. And a very, very typical and perhaps most classical example of this is if you look at the end of, let me find it, hold on a second, right here. If you look in verse 21, okay, look on page 281, chapter 11, verse 21. However, these you may eat of all the flying insects that walk on 4 legs, those which have knees extending above their legs, so that it hops on the ground with them. Okay? Of them, these you may eat. The locust to its kind, the sullen locust to its kind, the grasshopper to its kind, and the chagavhopper to its kind. I don't know, find me a chagavhopper. You know what I'm saying? I mean, personally, I'm not eating.
I'll pass.
I anything that has more than 4 legs.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my personal, okay, anything more than 4 legs, it's okay. Just, get me a little road spray and we're good to go. You know what I mean? But that's me. However, I hear that it's really a delicacy. And I want you to know that there was a time when Jews ate this because it says in the Torah it's kosher. Now you have to remember, it may sound weird, but if it's kosher, it is no different than a piece of gefilte fish that's kosher. It's no different than a piece of steak. It's no different than a slice of bread.
Indeed.
You understand? It's kosher. If it's kosher, it's kosher. If it's not kosher, it's not kosher. I don't care how good it looks and how great it sounds. So there's a time. In today's day and age, I don't know how many people are left that actually claim to know, to have the tradition, unbroken tradition. Perhaps I heard maybe some of the Yemenite Jews that came from certain parts of Yemen, because they had an unbroken chain all the way back to the Talmudical times. That's okay. If they have that, that's fine. And that's if they're certain that it's that thing and it has certain signs. And if you really, really want to know, you want to find out, the Rambam, Maimonides, describes it in detail, exactly which ones are and which ones aren't kosher. Now, personally, I don't care which ones are kosher because I'm not planning to eat it. However, this is another case of where the Ashkenazic Jew, for sure, and perhaps I should say 90-something% of the Sephardic world, cannot eat grasshoppers, even if there's a rabbi that comes today and says, no, I'm telling you, I did my research, I've been doing 30 years of research, and this is kosher. It could be technically kosher, but since we do not have the tradition, it is no longer kosher. Not because it's not kosher, but because there is something that overrides everything, that's the tradition. Okay? So this is a good example of that. And this same applies perhaps to fish, but fish is perhaps, you could say there's some fish, and there's been controversy, and you can look it up online today. You don't need me for this. But over time there's been controversy about certain fish. Is it really indeed a kosher fish, or is it not a kosher fish? Why? Because it's a newfound species, but it has fins, and it has scales, or it has the signs. Is it not? Should we eat it? Should we not eat it? People argue, no, it's never been eaten amongst Jews, and so on and so forth. Right? It doesn't mean you must stick to that. But, look, there's enough fish to go around, right? And speaking of fish has something very, very interesting and is unique. And it's because somebody asked me this question today. Rabbi, if I go to a supermarket, can I just buy fish? Raw fish. Can I buy raw fish? Raw meat, obviously not. And as I'll describe in a moment, there's a lot that goes into meat, to raw meat and cooked meat, that forget about it, right? But fish. And let me first preface with the following. Once we've gone through this and determined and checked off what an animal needs to have, what signs it needs to have in order to be or not to be kosher, one needs to now really know that that's not enough. You can't now sit down and eat it. First of all, you're never ever allowed to eat anything from a living animal. As long as it's alive, it cannot be eaten. But in order for it to come to a point, to a state of consumption, when it's kosher, by the way, the word kosher means what?
Fit.
Fit. It's fit. That's why kosher in food means fit for consumption. Kosher in an object means, let's say you say a kosher Torah, means that it's fit to be read from and to be said a blessing over and so on. Okay, recited blessing over and so on. A talit is fit, that means it's fit to be worn as a talit and to perform the mitzvah, and so on and so forth. So in order for the meat to now be kosher, to be fit for consumption, the animal has to be put to death. The way and the manner in which it's put to death is that it has to be slaughtered in accordance with the ritual directives of the Torah. The Torah tells us exactly how it needs to be slaughtered. Interestingly, it's not mentioned explicitly in the Torah. It's hinted to, and I want you to see in the very, very last verse of this week's Parsha, chapter 11, verse 47. It's on page 284. Hashem says, this is the verse 46. He says, this is the law concerning the animals and the fowl and all the creatures. And then he says in verse 47, to distinguish between the unclean and between the clean, meaning between that which is permissible, and between the living creatures which may be eaten, and between the living creatures which may not be eaten. It seems to be repetitive. Right? It's saying between the clean one and the unclean one, meaning between the one that's kosher or not. And then it says, no, well, there's another step, there's another aspect of this, which is the one that could be eaten or not. What difference would there be in the two? You're saying basically 6 of one, a half a dozen of the other. They're basically the same. You're saying the same thing, right? Well, no. The sages tell us that over here Hashem is hinting that there are a lot more rules that go into play, more than just what's written here explicitly. And that's what's passed down from generation to generation, beginning with Moses, through him, to all future generations. And one of the primary things is the laws of shchita, of slaughtering the animals in a very, very specific manner, without getting into too many details. Basically, just to cover it in short, basically, it's in the most humane way. It's in a way that it cuts the skin, not rips the skin. And that's why one of the primary objectives of becoming a shochet, which is a ritual slaughterer, is not so much the actual slaughtering, but it's how we say how to shtel a knife, how to sharpen the knife, how to make the knife in a way that it is so surgical. It's so fine, it is so sharp, and there's absolutely no blemishes in the knife. I mean, it's literally checked with your fingernail, and you need to develop a sensitivity for it, which I have to say, many, many years ago I studied, and I had this, but right now I couldn't do it just like that. Just pick it up like that. I have to get back into it. And I wouldn't take the risk of saying, no, that's kosher, that's fine, I checked it. Okay? It has to be so razor sharp, literally, in order to slaughter. That's a chicken, and then you have a bigger knife for what we call dakos for the small animals, let's say sheep or goat. Then you have a much bigger one for a cow. It's also the quality of the metal and so on. It doesn't bend. It doesn't hurt the animal. Literally, the animal doesn't know what's happening until it already happens. And the idea is that there's basically the two pipes that go, the windpipe, right, and the what do they call again? The
artery.
What? Not the artery. So I want to tell you something. If you, especially with a chicken, if you cut into the artery, which interestingly, when I was studying when I was studying many years ago how to slaughter chickens, okay, because at the time I was traveling to Russia and I used it actually so we can have chickens, we can have something to eat in the camp for the children. Otherwise, there was really nothing available at the time. Talking about the early 90s, almost nothing available. So there was a guy there cutting for halal. Besides the fact that his knife was full of blemishes. I mean, obviously...
It looked like a serrated knife.
Yeah, almost like a serrated knife. But he showed us that their objective, lahavdil, not to compare the two, is to cut into the artery to get the blood going. You know, it's kind of like almost like a hybrid they're trying to do between what they understand in the Torah, what they kind of stole from the Torah, or what they try to to build on, the aspect of not having blood. Yeah, the main blood comes out of there, and cutting the windpipe and the food pipe, the esophagus, but when you cut so deep, you're hitting the bone. When you hit a bone, you're ruining your knife. You can never cut so deep. You know what I mean? The incision that's made to cut, let's say, a chicken's neck, which that's what I learned, is so minuscule. It's literally, and that's it, done. Okay? It's done. It's slaughtered. Obviously, with a cow, which is something I never did, it's more intense, it's more involved. But the idea is that it's slaughtered in a certain way. Now, when it's slaughtered in that way, it actually is not only a physical application, but it has also that spiritual application in it that is now elevating that animal, so to speak, its soul and its purity to a much higher level. So that needs to be done. So now you cannot just buy any beef, because beef, although it originates in a cow, which is a potentially kosher animal, but the moment that it has been put to death, we've taken its life, not through the means of shechita, of proper ritual slaughtering, it is no longer kosher. Now that's not enough. It doesn't end there. Let me tell you what else goes into it. What else goes into it? Well,
salt.
No, before you salt it. Now, one needs to, and this takes us back to last Chumash, to the second book of the Torah. I want you to quickly take a quick look on page 196, on the bottom of page 196. That's in the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, chapter 22, verse 30. It says, "You shall be men, or you shall be people of holiness to me. You must not eat flesh that was torn off in the field. Throw it to the dog." Okay? What does it mean, you must not eat flesh that was torn off in the field? The word torn off, literally in Hebrew, is treifa. Thus the word treif. We use it very universally to say the opposite of kosher food is treif. Okay, but really treif is has a very specific meaning. Torn off, meaning, and it says in the field, this is not only in the field, but typically it will occur in the field that an animal of prey will dig its claws into another animal in order to subdue it, in order to kill it. Typically what they do, they don't know what they're doing, but their instincts they have them doing by nature, that they either do it in the neck to puncture the vital organs, right? Or the spinal cord, or somewhere in the torso of the animal, which is where the internal organs are. And those internal organs get punctured, and then the animal loses its stability and it dies. Or it's subdued, and now they can rip the flesh off of it. Thus, when we open an animal, even a chicken, there's an inspection that's made. Everything has to be intact. Everything has to be,
glad.
Even if it never ever came out of a closed encampment, it never had any encounter with an animal of prey. But the idea of it is, if there are any internal organs, or the vital organs, that had any puncture whatsoever, they were compromised in any way, not kosher. Even if the animal healed and has lived, and the proof is in the pudding, unless you would have slaughtered it, it would have continued living. But according to the Jewish law, according to the Torah, that animal is now treif. Thus, there is a general inspection that's made right away, and the most vital inspection that needs to be made, because typically this is the one that's more prone for problems, is the lungs. And there's what's called a bedikat chutz, an external inspection. And that is as soon as the animal is slaughtered, before wasting any time, starting to skin it, starting to check it, starting anything. It sounds a little gross, but the shochet sticks his hand in and counts to see if all the lobes of the lung is there and so on, and then it goes to the next stage. When it goes to the next stage, it's opened up, they check. If it has, for example, for whatever reason, it has some kind of crazy, unnatural birth defect of, let's say, having, 2 livers, 2 hearts, a deformed heart, or any of that, any of the vital organs, problem, you understand? Even though you say, but the animal looks fine, the flesh is going to taste good, everything's fine. Problem, that animal is not kosher. That animal is treif. It's as if it was devoured, because it wouldn't have lived a natural life past a certain point, because it's as if it's been compromised. Now, typically, the organ that has, I should say, some of the most, is prone to the most, is the lungs. Okay? The lungs and perhaps the intestines, because the animal eats and it can pick up nails and different needles and different things, or